a key part of being able to do skim is to be able to see an example of the full product, and so that's what we're going to do next. This will be up on the website, just the PowerPoint itself, but I wanted to talk it through. We're going to focus on the cartoon in front, the go way back and sit down cartoon from the Times of Richmond, though I do think it helps a little bit to have this little bit of a sidebar here about the President's Act that stirs the country. So, if you remember, this is using Claire Riley's, or a model of Claire Riley's layers of inference model chart. Our question is, how did newspapers across the US report and react to Booker T. Washington's dinner at the White House? This will also lead to an understanding of a little bit about race relations as a whole. So using this, and imagine that it's foolscap paper, we can place the cartoon or the source in the middle, or we could even just write source A, source B, and different people may have different sources. We did this with a group of graduate students, high school students, middle school students, and some teachers, and we started trying to milk the source for as much as we possibly could using the skim framework. And this is what we ended up with. Under summarizing, you can see all the details, contextualizing, inferring, monitoring. We had a series of details, so it was quite surprising how much we could actually wring out of this source. One thing we did was we had textbooks available, and we also had people jumping on the web, and some of them, even went to Wikipedia to try and find out little bits of information when ideas popped up based on the skim questions. In order to blow this up a little bit more detailed, let's look at summarizing first. So we had people looking at the cartoon, and basically the big question, though there's 4 other questions within, is what does the source tell us? We identified it was a political cartoon, we gave the date, and we talked about the caption. We also pointed out that the next to the cartoon was an article about the President's Act stirring the country, and that was about the dinner with Booker T. Washington. We also, in the cartoon itself, we had students identify a black man, a white man, a lady standing, who ended up being called Lady South because when we looked closely she had South written on her hat, and then in the very background we had to really focus and use a loop on the on Adobe, was former Governor Jones. We also, in terms of who is this for, we couldn't tell who the cartoonist was, but we said it was for the people of Richmond, at a minimum, who considered themselves Southerners. The perspective represents the South's general concern that a president invited a black man to the White House. Under contextualizing, we go to when, why, and how was the source produced. Again, you're going to get repetition, but this is a nice model to have students linger with the source. So we have the date of October 20th, 1901. We know the event was October 16th. The source we suggested was produced to suggest Southern states' shock at hearing about the dinner. One of the students jumped online and said, well, if that's 1901, well, Plessy v. Ferguson, Supreme Court, where separate but equal was declared as constitutional, and the idea of segregation was only, had only occurred 5 years prior. Other more global points to contextualizing: race relations is in its nadir, as James Lowen talked about. That came from a graduate student. We had Jim Crow legislation, especially in the South. There was now ongoing efforts to disenfranchise blacks in the southern states. Lynchings were common. That was coming from the textbook. We also had a student who pointed out that this was really early in Theodore Roosevelt's presidency. In fact, it was just a month prior that President McKinley had been assassinated, and TR came to power as the youngest president at the time. One of the most interesting comments that came up was that while we had racial segregation, one of the things that we could say about this is Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, there were African Americans who were coming to prominence in both black and white communities. A final contextualizing piece of information that came from the textbook was that Roosevelt was a Republican, and in that opened up ideas about who supported the Republicans, who supported the Democrats, and that Republican Party really had a great deal of African American support, and they often were the ones who came to the conventions. Then we moved into inferring. What does the cartoon suggest? Well, some of the insights included the cartoon suggests that this act was done in Washington, in front of the Capitol, so it was probably the White House, just based on the very fact that the Capitol's in the background. And then they also have details that probably Governor Jones is concerned, or he wants to know what's going on in the meeting because he's peering in. Another inference is that Lady South was poking or interrupting Roosevelt, and the idea there is that Roosevelt should be listening to the southern states, and he should not break the rules of segregation, which was a nice inference from a student. Another inference was that the South is obviously unhappy with Roosevelt, and that she represents the South and is wanting Booker T. Washington wanting Roosevelt to separate from Booker T. Washington. We had quite a lot of conversation about get way back. So people were wanting to know if that actually meant move the table, move away, if the way it was spelled suggested a southern accent. Also, there was a suggestion that maybe get way back meant go back in time and remember the days and the values of white supremacy, and that you've got to go back in time, and this cannot happen. Another thing that came out that we didn't record was just the very fact that it kind of reflected the 1960s and 1950s, the idea of blacks being at the back of the bus. But that seemed out of context when we're looking at 1901. But get way back, we were thinking either move away or go back in time to segregation and remember those days. An interesting inference that came from a student was that Roosevelt has a napkin in and he's kind of perched on the corner. One idea was that the napkin suggested that Roosevelt was more well-mannered and civilized, but he was also cozying up to Washington. These were quite good inferences that came out of the analysis. So then we moved to monitoring questions. What else would I like to find out? What questions do I now need to ask? One of the key questions, and imagine if you've got different students looking at different newspaper articles, is this representative of the Southern press? Another one is, how did the Northern press and African American press write about this, and were there common themes and common responses? How did the rest of the nation feel? What did other politicians say about this event? And then we had some very specific questions. If this was first given without much context, what was the dinner about? What led to the dinner? What was discussed? Does anybody actually know? Is that the cause of concern about what was being discussed, or was it the fact that just Washington was black and shouldn't be there was the belief? What were the results of the dinner? What impact did the dinner have on Roosevelt, Washington, on Governor Jones, and race relations as a whole? So there's some nice questions there that when looking at other newspapers and then laying out against the textbook and maybe what's on the internet, we could really start unpacking some great insights there. Another question was, who the heck's Governor Jones and why is he looking through the window? Is he angry? Is he a supporter of Washington? Have they been talking about him? Is he indebted to Roosevelt or Washington? What is going on there? We recognise that in 1901 people might know about this, and so in other newspapers there might be direct reference to Jones, and we will get more of an information. We also had a couple of guys jump online and Google him, went to Wikipedia and started piecing together his relationship to the two principals. We also wondered if political cartoons were generally on the front cover of newspapers or the front page, and if they were always next to a key article, as we see here. We also then really started wondering what get way back meant, and was it a common saying, was it a way to chastise, or was it about the past and the idea of the goal of whites maintaining political and social power. Going back to the etiquette, is there anything in the position to Roosevelt at the corner of the table, and dinner etiquette, the use of his napkins, now he's holding the fork? But we also acknowledge, and this is very important, that we did feel like this cartoon was a useful source to give an initial glimpse into one Southern newspaper's view of their discontent with the events surrounding the dining of Washington.